Well, I think there's no question that it'll keep going. The great irony of the land selection, in my view, was the line from the Mondale forces that this would somehow help him in the South. It may perhaps help him in Georgia, but I don't, having lived in Mississippi and talked with other senators from the South, I can't see that Lance's popularity is particularly great in that region of the country. I'm as puzzled as others by the selection, and I think the story will not soon disappear. I tried to ask a question, but as I wasn't wearing a red dress, I was not called on. It seems to be the... Well, apparently Reagan is fond of red, and I was astonished to go over to the White House and find about a half a dozen female correspondents wearing red dresses. I didn't know that that was the cue, and I was wearing blue. Very clever. Georgia was the only Deep South state he lost, and of course New Jersey, and the appeal to the Italian voters is probably going to be with us for the whole campaign. Mrs. Ferraro's Queens district voted 55% for Reagan, and I think it's very clever of him not to concede it to her. I think he looks like he's having a wonderful time out there. His pitch, which we saw in the campaign commercials earlier this year, and clearly being repeated this week all over the country, is why would you go back? The country seems to be in better shape. There's some headlines that seem to dispute that, and I'm sure the Democrats will raise issues like the bailout or government intervention in the Continental Bank case in Illinois. And those will become issues, I'm sure. But I think it's clear that his pitch to voters in Texas, as elsewhere, will be, why would America go back? Well, perhaps the heat will prevent some protesters from massing at the doors. I think the larger problem that Republicans, frankly, are having now is how to make this convention other than dull. They are talking about multimedia slideshows on the platform to keep a good audience on certain evenings of the convention. They're talking about a star galaxy of Republicans to come in and speak. That may be their bigger problem. The choice of San Francisco by the Democrats was interesting to me. At the beginning of the week out there was considerable opinion that that was a mistake because every group of special interest types, from the gays and the lesbians to the handicapped, would be at the doorstep of the Democrats, making it appear to be a party of special interests. I think by the end of the week there was a feeling that perhaps it was something the Democrats could use to rebound in their own favor, that the appearance of an umbrella party of many diverse groups was amplified by what was happening outside the convention hall. Of course, there are always events that cannot be controlled, and I'm sure that was more true of the Democrats than will be true of the Republicans. I'm fond of a chant I overheard in San Francisco, which I'm sure will not make print anywhere, at the gay-lesbian march, in which protesters marched along shouting 1, 2, 3, 4, we don't want Reagan anymore, 5, 6, 7, 8, Reagan thinks his son is straight. That kind of flippant observation about the national political scene will probably not be seen from Dallas, where we can expect more control. Neuman Fellow is a very lucky journalist who was awarded a gift of a year off to study at Harvard and soak up academia. The concept originally was, what happens if we take rough-hewed journalists and throw them into an academic setting? Will they absorb it or kick it back? And it's just an opportunity to take a year off from the pace of daily deadlines and do more serious reflection on issues. I think it has made me less linear in my career ambitions and more interested in a broader range of things. Among the other topics I studied at Harvard were 17th century Dutch painting, which is not something I call on very often in my work, but I'm very happy to have had that opportunity. Well, it's amusing to me. You know, recently I was in Mississippi to do a piece on the United States Senate race down there. It's one of 6 seats that the Democrats think they can win back, and it was fairly early in the campaign, and very few had focused on it, and I was trying to elicit some response from voters about how they felt on the Senate race, and I spotted 2 gentlemen at one rally wearing "Where's the Beef" t-shirts, and I thought, wonderful, these are Mondale people, they will be up on astute politics, and they can give me a quote on the Senate race. So I went over and talked to them, and it became clear to me within a very few minutes that these people had never heard of Walter Mondale. They were Wendy's people. And I thought to myself, it is useful at times to leave Washington and discover that the rest of the world does not orbit around the politics that those of us in Washington like to breakfast, lunch, and dinner with. Well, he's probably ahead, but I don't think anyone is crediting him. I mean, I think he's right, and that article seems to bear out. And even Reagan in his press conference Tuesday night was careful not to rule out completely a tax increase. I don't think there's any question that if current spending trends continue, something will be needed to raise revenues. But I'm not sure that that is translating into support for Walter Mondale by the voters. There seems to be a residual trust in Ronald Reagan, despite what columnists might say. I was struck in this, my first week on the White House beat, by the power that President Reagan has to work his will on Capitol Hill. Legislation that had been sitting dormant for some time was suddenly on the front burner, and Congress very quickly enacted watered-down versions of, but still took action on things like school prayer and Jane Doe funding. So I think that it is, all of that may be true, and still we will see action. Well, I presume that the caller is referring to the tainted delegates issue raised by Gary Hart during the primary campaign. Yeah, that was union money that helped pay for some of his campaign costs that resulted in delegates Hart said were thus tainted because Mondale had already hit his spending limits. I don't know the status of that. I suspect that Gary Hart, who has a massive campaign debt of his own, is not pressing very hard for the Federal Elections Commission to continue its investigation. Whether they are or not, I don't know. It is a good question. The other point about Tip O'Neill, I'm not sure I understand the question, but I would just throw in the thought that we're in for a whole year of politics and sort of a political conversation through the press between the Democrats on the Hill and Reagan in the White House. And it will be a debate, at times petty, and sometimes without much substance. But I don't put great stock. I don't collect a lot of tapes on that sort of stuff. Well, I disagree with that, and I am alone, I suppose, in this, but I am unclear as to why Mondale does not more fully embrace Jesse Jackson. It seems to me that he holds at least one of the keys to Mondale's possible election in November. And when we left San Francisco last Friday, there was considerable turmoil among some of the black delegates to that convention. Mayor Hatcher, one of Jackson's supporters, put it quite bluntly. He said the women got theirs, the South got theirs, a reference to Burt Lance. Even Gary Hart got his, and we ain't got nothing. I think they are waiting for a signal from Mondale that he understands both their needs and their importance to him. And I don't see Jackson cooling either his foreign affairs rhetoric or his alliance with Mr. Farrakhan. As you mentioned, I was on the Central America trip with Mr. Jackson, and I took home with me, I suppose, the most fascinating sight of Jesse Jackson touring communist schools that have been set up for children from schools like in countries like Angola, and smiling and kissing babies and and behind him following aides passing out 8x10 glossies of Jesse Jackson. And I thought myself that that Jackson was networking in the third world, which he views as really the future. And so I see no possibility or interest in his cooling this talk. I quite agree with the caller. In fact, I would love to do an interview with Mrs. Ferraro's husband in which I ask him such questions as, what are you planning to serve at your first state dinner? Do you plan to redecorate? What size shoe do you wear, and who does your hair? There has always been a certain factor or tendency by the press to lean toward the petty, the symbolism, as you put it. The question is whether the press does that because that is what people want to read, or because that is what the press wants to write. And I think that this is not a long enough program for us to debate that fully. It is true that most people get their news from television, and television is rather a medium of symbols, and I think that's the kind of world we live in. I, for one, would love to do more issue pieces about the candidates, and I wonder how many would read them. I think she puts new energy into the race, and may even cloud the fact that it is Walter Mondale who is running for president. I think that she speaks for a good number of people. You know, that Reagan certainly tried this week to make that point that the Mondale-Ferraro ticket is so far to the left that it has left America. I think that was his quote. And so I think the caller may speak for a number. I'm not sure why she should feel abandoned, though, by the Democratic Party. It is a system of choices, and I think, as pollster Teeter, the Republican pollster out of Detroit, has said, this is probably going to be a more ideological election at the presidential level than we've seen in some time. Voters will have a choice. There are a number of people, she mentioned Clemens' voice as well, and there are a number of people who find Walter Mondale's voice a bit whiny. We'll see what impact that has. Well, I thought it was an interesting thought that perhaps this would be a campaign where morality would be the central issue. I certainly hope not, because it seems to me there's enough in each party that would preclude that kind of emphasis. As to the polls, I'm as mystified by them as most. And you know, there are some people who think that this could be another Truman Dewey year, where the polls are so wrong that the victor will have the glory of a newspaper headline to defy the morning after November 6th. I don't know anyone who's ever been polled. And that doesn't mean anything. I don't know that many people. But it is a young science and an inexact science. I suspect, like any bureaucracy in Washington, once in place, it is rarely repealed. But I think it's an interesting thought that might be addressed to your congressman. Oh, I think that's the case. I
mean, is there a real...
That is both Mondale's challenge and problem, I suppose. But I think that blacks and women need to be visible in high places, in policy-making places, for him to get the kind of support that he needs from those two groups. It's interesting about Kathy Bushkin that she probably emerges as the one victor in the Hart campaign this year. She was, as you say, quite popular and managed to hold credibility despite what blips the candidate might have been on. And it's just an interesting little inside Washington effect that sometimes a staff member can outlast his or her candidate. Well, I doubt that. Perhaps they are of a different generation, although that even that is questionable. I don't really know. It may be that the press gives more attention to a Jane Fonda for other reasons, having little to do with her entertainment status than it might to a Frank Sinatra. The more interesting part of the question to me is about the bias in the media, and this is something that we, the caller might be surprised that we do worry about. And I really don't know. I would be interested in other people's thoughts. I doubt that the the bulk of the editors or reporters at the Wall Street Journal consider themselves liberal. That may be neither here nor there. Well, I was just going to say that I think one of the reasons that USA Today is appealing to readers across the country is that it makes a real attempt, and I must tell you this is somewhat frustrating as a writer, to delete adjectives and interpretation and analysis and really serve up the news more like television. And so it may be capitalizing on a certain distrust that the caller may have been voicing of a liberal bias. I think you can believe him now because it's 1984 and it's an election year, and it's pretty clear from this week's events that both the President and Congress have one eye on the electorate. Yeah, I would bank on it. It's really quite interesting. I thought this week that going over each day, you are presented with a jigsaw puzzle, and Larry Speaks gives you the largest piece, sort of the party line. And then it is really a job of getting enough of the other people who hold the other pieces of the puzzle to call you back so that you get the full picture. I personally thought it could be a dangerous beat if one sat there too long. I think it's important to make contacts in the White House and so that you do get the full picture. I suppose they do. You know, this weekend the Bohemian Club out in California, which is that exclusive all-male purview, is taking its annual hiking retreat up into the Redwood Mountains in California. It used to be that several administration officials would go on that before it received so much publicity, and one of the tasks of the press in its current state is this week I spent some time on the phone seeing if any of the administration officials were planning to do that this weekend. Because of our attention, because of having to live in a fishbowl, none that I could find are, so I suppose they will just stay home. Well, I'm fascinated by your fascination with the use of photos in newspapers. It's an area I hadn't thought much about. But the thing to keep in mind with Reagan is that as the incumbent, he is not only holding all the cards, but he has surrounded himself with some very able advertising executives who will use him to the maximum, and I suppose others will try, as always, to come along on his coattails. It's an interesting, astute observation, really, about the power struggle that went on just before the Democratic Convention. I am told that the reason we readers even heard about that was that Mr. Manette, getting wind of his disfavor within the Mondale forces, leaked that to the press, and that and there ensued this really embarrassing flat for the Democrats. I don't see how this reflects on Jimmy Carter unless you feel this is a Democratic trait, in which case you would be well to keep notes or take tapes, as an earlier caller did. But I think there will be some shifting of position in both camps. It is a Reagan administration which favors deregulation of banking that just today or yesterday announced plans to bail out Continental Illinois Bank in Chicago. So I suppose it's whichever way you choose to look at the coin. I think Mondale's lack of decisiveness or his reputation for that will be an issue, but I can't imagine that anyone except voters with long memories will link it to Jimmy Carter. I think we'll see more of them. You know, in Washington they call Reagan the Teflon man. Very little sticks to him. And it is quite remarkable that we have these unprecedented deficits from a president who promised us a balanced budget. And I'm quite sure the Democrats will remind us of that through the fall. I mean, there is you know, you can go to lunch now. There won't be any news till 1:30. You can get lazy over there. The other thing that struck me at the press conference Tuesday was, I suppose, an endorsement of the view that that Reagan is a great communicator, which is that he was, to me, to my subjective eyes, less persuasive in that room at the White House than he was on television I will be doing some campaigning, yes. Yes, I will be in Dallas for the convention. I'm not sure yet what my assignment will be. And then I will do some campaigning in the fall. I find campaign coverage difficult because it is so over-covered. In San Francisco, there were 14,000 reporters there, and I often woke up saying, well, certainly they don't need me. It's a real challenge to try and find a slightly different spin that won't be repetitious or duplicative of everything that one reads elsewhere. Thank you, I enjoyed it.